Welcome to this week's edition of Freedom and Prosperity Radio, the weekly radio news magazine that we put together here at the Virginia Institute for Public Policy. So when you start hearing all the name calling or all the rhetoric, or you see red lights on a stage and Marines, you understand that there's reality out there beyond just the made-for-TV drama. And one of the things that I don't care who you are, I may be able to point my fingers at 2 or 3 people that I know that have been trying to live off the grid. Otherwise, you're using some electric utilities generations, and for the most part, we get around in vehicles, and we're going to spend a lot of time this week talking about both of those things with Steve Hayner from the Thomas Jefferson Institute. You read his stuff at Bacon's Rebellion as well. Steve, welcome back. How are you doing this morning, sir?
I'm doing great. It looks like a beautiful day after the rain last night.
Yep, amen to that. And on these kind of gray, cloudy days, I imagine the solar cells are really cranking it out at full song, aren't they? I'm sorry, that's cheap shots.
Give them till noon. They usually need till about noon to warm up. But
I have relatives like that. I have some relatives that's about the way they are, and especially here in a college town. But seriously, I want to jump into the news of the day, and you have a great column, and I want to thank you because I was a lone voice out there. Everyone was losing their collective mind over the idea that Virginia had basically said "Me Too" to anything California does towards the environmental regulations, and we covered the story when the General Assembly was debating HB 1965, and everyone said, yeah, but we don't have a majority, and that was the answer to it. So here we are. As I understand it, the board that determined that California was going to ban the sale of internal combustion vehicles by severely curtail it by 2035, and then leading to an outright ban. It was a 4-member commission of governor appointees.
In the California Air Resources Board, I honestly don't know how many members there are, but yes, it's very much like our own air pollution control board. It's a citizen board appointed by the governor. Yeah. So
the governor has said he's going to do everything he can, and the attorney general is investigating things they can do to it. But it looks like it was duly passed by the legislature, whether it makes any sense or not, or even could hold up in court. It was passed by a duly elected legislature, signed by the duly elected governor, and aside from being crazy, it seems buttoned up to this point.
Well, again, it doesn't really go into effect until 2025. And so we've got a couple of years. The 2022 General Assembly did try to repeal it. I mean, there was a bill that passed the House. Straight party line vote. The Republicans now have the majority in the House, and they did get a bill passed to repeal the regulation and force our air board to consider it again and do it properly this time with a full regulatory process. And you do a full regulatory process, and you start seeing what the impacts are and what the financial impacts are, all the stuff you don't get when you do an emergency regulation. Mm-hmm. But that bill passed the House on a straight party line vote, went to a Senate committee controlled by Democrats, and died in that committee on a straight party line vote. So really, it's a question of forcing the General Assembly to address these issues, and people voting in the next General Assembly election and deciding how important these issues are to them as they pick a new legislator, because the whole legislature is up for election in a little over a year.
I still think that there's an existential sidebar I want to go into here for a moment, Steve, is those committees that you mentioned in the Virginia Senate. They have gentleman's agreement, gentle person's agreement to ostensibly keep power sharing, I think is what they call it in the House. So the majority in the Senate has set up most of these committees in such a ridiculously overwhelming majority to the majority party, even though they only have a 1-seat majority in the body at large. I've talked to Republicans. A lot of them aren't really keen, or they think it's too wonky, or they don't want to be seen publicly stating whether they would give that up. I would call on courageous conservatives, to say, yeah, I'll fix that so that we can get a 50-50 committee. Maybe the majority party gets the chair so they can call the agenda. But it should look at least like the body at large, don't you think?
Well, the body's 21-19. And the committee that took this up is not one of the ones that the Democrats have stacked. It was actually an 8-7 committee, 15 members, 8 Democrats, 7 Republicans. So, the vote, it's if the Republicans were in charge and it was 21-19, the fair way to divide the committees would also be
8-7. Okay.
Yeah, 8-7. I mean, I think that's pretty reasonable. But in all fairness, I mean, I think the problem is that on the Democratic side, they just assume this whole climate change thing is the end of the world, and that anything we do that reduces the use of carbon dioxide fuels, anything we do that reduces CO2 from power plants, is saving the world from a fate, the fiery deaths. And it's being fed, of course, by constant daily media coverage. I was just looking at something online just a minute ago about some glacier somewhere, the glacier of death or something. If it melts, it totally ignores the fact that, in about 2 months, it's going to start snowing again in Greenland. Okay. I mean, it melts in the summer and then it comes back in the winter,
Right. Well,
and is it all coming back 100%? No, maybe 99.5%, but it is not all melting away in the next, 20 years. This is just ridiculous. But people have been told this, and unfortunately they believe it. So people have been told that we have to get rid of gasoline and diesel electric vehicles and replace them with electric, because otherwise we're all going to die a fiery death in climate change.
Well, isn't "if" the biggest 2-letter word in the entire climate agenda? Because we'll get 3-page news stories and magazine articles and full documentaries based on if all these things happen in this order at this time with these mitigating catastrophe.
And the other word to watch for is model, MODEL, because most of these horrifying outcomes are based on models. Right. And a model is just a mathematical tool, and it's only as good as the data you feed into it, and it's controlled by the data you feed into it. So again, models are models. They're, all models are wrong. Some models are useful, but getting back to the car thing, the governor, the attorney general, if they're going to abide by the law, then they have to abide by the law. There's maybe some wiggle room there, and the Air Board may have some wiggle room in terms of what it adopts. I mean, I think a decision to just flat out not do this would probably end up in court, and I'm not sure what a court would do. But again, I think the cleanest solution is to just continue to go after it at the General Assembly and try to reverse course, and not just on the automobile stuff. There's a lot more going on than that.
Well, you mentioned 2025, and we have a 2023 election, so hopefully this will be a campaign issue for that. Stephen Hainer from the Thomas Jefferson Institute, and of course, writer. You can read his stuff at Bacon's Rebellion. We're talking about the plan to ban internal combustion cars. But yeah, and the reason I had talked about the emergency and the use of the word "if" was because it is in the derby to replace COVID-19 as the global health pandemic that will allow governors like, Glenn Youngkin or anyone to impose dictatorial measures in the same way they did with COVID-19. And I worry that we've set the precedent, and now it just is a kind of a horse race between climate change and gun violence to see which becomes the next critical health crisis that requires immediate action. Harumph, harumph, harumph.
Well, I think they've been building the climate change case now for coming up on 30 years, and 30 years of predictions and 30 years of predictions which have turned out to be false completely across the board. But people still make the predictions. This year we were supposed to have the worst hurricane season ever. And I still think there's plenty of time, obviously, for Virginia to get hit by a hurricane. So don't relax your preparations. But clearly at this stage, it's not going to be the worst season ever. And these predictions are based on models, and the models are wrong. Again, people need to decide: do they care? People need to decide: do they believe this stuff? And if they've come to the conclusion, like I have, that this whole climate change catastrophe narrative is way overblown, it's about half overblown and half wrong. They need to communicate that to their leaders and say, "Look, we're not buying this." And that's, to some extent with the COVID, the difference with the COVID was there was scientific evidence. You could do an actual scientific study on what was working, what wasn't working in terms of medicines or vaccines. Climate change is such a big deal. They can't actually do experiments. They can't do studies. Mm-hmm. So I'm sorry for the beeping. I don't know how to turn that off.
Well, and when they do, they seem to leave data that leads them to an inconvenient truth out, and then say, well, if again exactly. You go back to modeling. Well, if this model leaves out all these temperatures, we can come up with the answer we want. And the trouble is this is interestingly enough, if it's a pharmaceutical company trying to get science, politics to back their science, the members of the majority party in the Senate will be all against it, and it's big pharma and so on and so forth. But if it's big energy, if it's big solar, if it's big wind, saying we'd really like some science that helps us sell these solar panels and these automotive batteries that you can run your car on, they seem to be all fine with it.
Well, they're fine with it, and of course, what they've been able to accomplish are all the subsidies and the tax breaks that change the numbers. California is the stick. California and again, one point I want to be sure everybody understands: Virginia is not the only state that has hitched its wagon to California on this. It's one of about 15 or 17 states that have done so. But California is the stick. And then you look at this what I call the Inflation Reignition Act, that passed Congress, that with all these subsidies for electric vehicles and subsidies for the industry and subsidies to build out the charging infrastructure. So, there's the carrot and the stick. The federal government's providing the carrot. California is providing the stick. Sure. And Virginia, unfortunately, has grabbed the wrong end of that stick, and we're part of that. But again, I think everybody should be skeptical of everybody. That's just sort of the way I am. It's the way I work. And the wind industry, the solar industry is just as profit motivated. The electric vehicle industry is hugely profit motivated. Oh, yeah. They've got all kinds of financial stake in this outcome, and they're behind this. I mean, the industry itself is the Virginia's Automobile Dealers Association supported this bill. They asked for this bill. They were happy with a bill that is going to limit the choices that their customers have over the next 5, 10, 15 years, which is a pretty amazing thing.
Well, you see, and I think I've heard the phrase Baptist and bootleggers before, when climate is discussed. But even big oil companies like BP or even Dominion will jump into this, saying, "Well, we have the resources to." Invest in this, and we can be the dominant force in this, perhaps not even in the way we are in petroleum, let's say BP's
well,
case.
Again, if say that this succeeds, and in 2035, every new vehicle under 14,000 pounds, every new truck, has to be an EV. Gee. Where do they get the electricity? Mm-hmm. Who builds the power plants? Who makes the profit on the power plants? Who sells the electricity? That would be, the utilities. That would be the Dominions and the APCOs and the XLs of the world. So they're not going to sit there and help help us stop them from having so many millions of new customers.
Right, exactly. And more kilowatt hours.
They're all for it. So that's what you're up against is. And it's a free country, and capitalism rules, and that's why I tell everybody to just sort of pay attention to who, sui bono, who's benefiting.
The issue with the electric utilities, though, ironically, a week after they enacted this law that said that they were going to ban the sale of electric internal combustion cars, the electric grid went into crisis, and they had to tell everyone in California, listen, don't shut off all your appliances between 4 and 7 p.m. because nobody ever uses appliances then, Steve, because their electric grid couldn't handle the load they had now. What gives any of these states, but we're talking about Virginia, the idea that our grid, even by the time we get to this point, would be able to handle all the electricity for all the volts and bolts and Teslas and Marconis or whatever we call them? That's why I use the word fantasy, because they have not thought through the engineering. They have not thought through the expense of what it would take. They have not thought through how many more gigantic power lines are going to be needed. When you build
one power plant, you build a power line to that power plant. When you build 100 solar farms, that's 100 power lines you have to build.
Wow.
People are missing that point. That you're going to have to connect all this stuff, interconnect all this stuff in the grid, and that's why distributed energy has its advantages, but this is the big disadvantage. So, California is everybody needs to watch California and see what it goes through the next couple of years. Everybody needs to watch Europe this winter because Europe is facing all this. Europe has also gone big time into wind, big time into solar. But they were backing it up with Russian gas and Russian oil. Wow. Well, guess what? The Russian gas and the Russian oil aren't there now, so they're paying incredible amounts of money for electricity in Europe right now, and it's likely to, unless the situation's resolved very quickly, it's going to be bad all the way through the winter.
I had heard some of the German nuclear power plants were trying to get refired up. I guess that's a bad word to use for nuclear power plants, but get geared up again. What about, and I've read fascinating stuff about these modular nuclear generators. Yes. What about those? Let's just say, the electric vehicles are the future. Okay, I'm going to leave aside the what do we do with the batteries? We'll get to that later. We'll leave aside what do we do with the solar cells? We'll get to that later. Do we look at these modular nuclear generators as potentially a regional source for the power needed for these electric vehicles?
Well, again, the small modular reactors are usually exactly what they say. They're fairly small. 20 megawatts, 40 megawatts. I haven't looked too closely at what's exactly out there now. There's a couple. There are a couple going into operation. To get a real load out of them, you have to sort of put several in sequence, maybe 8 or 10 of them together. And you see those photographs of that power plant in Ukraine. There's 6 reactors at that power plant. That's a lot of reactors. That's more than most plants usually have. But this would be a similar situation where you'd have 6 or 8 or 10 reactors in sequence. I mean, the small modular reactors are basically a modernized technology that the Navy's been using since the 60s. I mean, this is basically the kind of reactor that you have in the aircraft carriers and the submarines. That's about the size we're talking about. Okay. And it's not like we haven't done these, and they have had an incredible safety operation for years, safety record for years. People are terrified of nuclear. I don't understand why, but they are, and that's the real problem. But there's reason to believe we can build more nuclear. I mean, there's a lot of research being done on hydrogen. I'm skeptical, but I'm curious, and it may turn out to be a very effective source. But I still think long term, if you want a grid with a lot less fossil fuels, it's going to have to be replaced by nuclear.
Well, let me get into the other side of it, because you talk about people being terrified of nuclear, and I think some of it is it begins with Dustin Hoffman and the 3 Mile Island movie and the 3 Mile Island incident, but then you have Chernobyl and then you have Fukushima, none of which have much in the way to compare to American technology. As a matter of fact, 3 Mile Island, 20 years later, they went back and they said, you know what, there really has not been any discernible change in health outcomes.
Nobody died in 3 Mile Island.
Right. Exactly.
Nobody died from that. Nobody, and in Fukushima, the only 2 deaths were 2 guys who drowned in the wave. They weren't killed by the reactor; they were killed by the wave. So, at this point, they're not seeing the kind of predicted problems in Japan. So, again, but that doesn't stop people from believing everything they hear. And again, we've seen that with COVID, and we've seen that with other things too. I mean, the rumors kind of outdo the facts pretty quickly all across the board, left and right.
But one of the things that is reality is outside of France, most countries don't get as much as they could out of the fuel rods, and that's our own NRC rules disposal of it. Let's turn to disposal of some of this stuff. So California says we have to go to electric cars because it's clean. Right. Define clean for me, Steve. Steve Hayner is on with us from the Thomas Jefferson Institute. He has worked on all, I think, if there's a side of government and industry and private sector and public sector, he has been in it during his life. You read his stuff at Bacon Rebellion. But when you look at how to dispose of, California itself says solar panels are a toxic, a hazardous substance to dispose of.
As they exist now, it's covered by the Resource Recovery Act, the old RCRA law that covers other toxic waste. I mean, there are valuable elements in there. The question is, and the work is being done, and I don't discount the possibility that it's going to greatly improve, but they need to find a way to recycle that stuff. Mm-hmm. We can't just bury it in landfills. We can't just bury all this stuff in landfills. And the metals in there come from, there was this great situation recently where the New York Times was screaming and yelling about all the mining going on in the Amazon region. And they're right. There's a lot of mining going on in the Amazon region down in Brazil. Well, guess what they're looking for? They're looking for all the minerals and metals that you got to have to build these batteries. That's what the gold rush is down there. And do you want it? If you want this stuff, we're going to have to go dig it out of the ground and get it. And so again, clean is it's only clean if all you care about is carbon dioxide emissions. And even then, it's not nearly as clean as they claim it is because of how you have to build these cars and dispose of these cars. So. Clean is one of those terms that's, in the eye of the beholder. But I think look, I don't want to sound like I'm opposed to electric vehicles. I'm not. I think some of them are really, really cool. And I would certainly be willing to buy one, if I had the charging infrastructure on my house. But at the same time, I don't think I should be forced to buy one. And that's what this regulation does. Mm-hmm. This regulation takes away choices.
Well, certainly even in our flagship area, they're talking about a 650-acre municipal solar array, while they're also claiming they don't have enough land for housing to create affordable housing for people working at, menial or minimum wage jobs and retail jobs. And I said, well, instead of just 650 acres of solar panels, how about we build 650 acres of houses and put a solar panel on the roof of everyone? I don't care, but
that's again. As with the cars, also the solar. There's a role for solar, and it can be very effective in certain areas. It makes more sense in the desert than it does in northern Germany, But again, I think there's no balance. They're not interested in balance. It's all got to be perfect. It's all got to be the old phrase is that the perfect is the enemy of the good, and these people are really wedded to perfect.
That's right, and only if perfect comes to fruition does it all work.
You got to get to perfect, which is pretty hard.
Steve Hayner is on with us. We're going to change gears here and go to another subject that Steve has written extensively on, and I want to catch up on it because it involves electricity again, but it also involves utilities and the government and the State Corporation Commission nearly getting it right, and as I see the story, then hiccuping or perhaps throwing the ball over the first baseman's head. Steve, catch us up on the Ralph Northam Memorial Wind Farm Array in the Atlantic Ocean that a couple of weeks ago Dominion had said, fine, if you're going to make us...
If you're going to tell us we cannot pass the cost to the ratepayer,
right,
we're not going to do it. And they won't take any of the risk. They want us to carry all the risk on that thing.
But then the State Corporation Commission, if I'm not mistaken, then said, okay, we'll hold some more hearings on it. Is this the SEC blinking?
No, I don't think so. The SEC issued a ruling and approved the project, but approved the project with a fairly significant condition. And the condition was that Dominion would promise to produce a certain percentage of electricity out of the plant. Every 3 years, it would hit a 40% target, basically, of production, which again, is not 100%. It's not 50%. It's just 40%. But if they don't get to 40%, and if that means that the ratepayers are paying an additional amount of money, that would come not from the ratepayers, but it would come from the company. The company would have to eat that. And that's what Dominion has refused to do. They have refused to take on any risk that a hurricane or a 6-month period of no wind or some maintenance problem that takes down half the turbines. They don't want that risk. They want that risk to be on you and me as the ratepayers. So what the SEC issued its ruling, and as is its perfect legal right, Dominion filed a petition asking for a reconsideration on that point. So there's now a petition for reconsideration pending at the SEC. Dominion filed a brief arguing why it thought that was an unfair thing and an illegal thing for the SEC to do. Everybody on the other side has a chance to file a brief or file an argument saying, no, it's a perfectly legitimate thing to do. And then the SEC will rule one way or the other again. Now, the SEC is just two judges. So for all I know, they were 1-1. I don't know. Know. You don't know what the internal vote is usually. So but if the SEC stands firm on the requirement, then Dominion has one more step. It can appeal to the Virginia Supreme Court. And I would expect it will. It will go to the Supreme Court and ask that question. Because, again, it's a $10 billion project. And to build it and to finance it and to run it for 30 years is actually going to cost the ratepayers $21 billion.
Wow.
Because there's profit and there's interest and there's expensive operations. So it's a $21 billion project. And of that, the biggest element is, guess what? Profit for the utility. So like $7 billion of profit in there somewhere. So obviously they're going to fight pretty hard to preserve that. And I expect them to go to the Supreme Court to do so.
When it comes right down to it, though, is it, and is better even the right word to apply here, Steve? You tell me. Is the Virginia electrical consumer better off if we don't follow this folly into the Atlantic Ocean and try to build this wind farm that nobody's ever built in a hurricane alley before, and even to this scale?
I mean, I think it is a very bad investment for the ratepayers. There are a couple things that could make it less dangerous. One would be if Dominion was just buying the power from a third-party company. If you look at all the other proposals on the East Coast so far, all the others, the utility is not going to actually own the turbines.
Really?
They're not building the turbines. They're not using ratepayer money to build the turbines. Ørsted, Avangrid, other companies basically are building the turbines on spec, just like you build a house on spec. But they have a contract to sell the power. So I give you a contract to buy power. It's 30 cents a kilowatt hour. And with that guarantee, you go out and build the power plant. And so in those cases, if the hurricane comes along and knocks it out, I mean, there still will be some hit on the ratepayers when that happens. But it's also going to be mainly a hit on that private developer, Avangrid and Ørsted. They can go out and get insurance, and they can hedge their bets other ways. Dominion is the only one on the East Coast, the only utility so far that has basically said, we're going to make the ratepayers pay 100%, and we're going to make the ratepayers carry 100% of the risk. And that's what the SEC noticed, and the SEC said, nah, that's not fair. You can't do that to Virginians. And hooray for the SEC doing that. Yeah,
it's what we generally hope. I thought they were a larger body than just two judges, but
well, they're missing one, but it's only three. I mean, they've got a fairly good sized staff, but in terms of it's people don't understand. It's a court. It's basically a court of record, and it operates like a court. So it's run by three judges.
Steve, then the last one on this, and I know a lot of this feeds from this 2050 net zero carbon future that the previous administration had really been married to. How much of this needs to be unplugged because it doesn't, as we discussed earlier, actually pencil out unless every single thing goes exactly the way the models that we've built based on our own, hopes and dreams and aspirations come to fruition?
I think the goal that was set by the General Assembly in the bill that they passed in 21, that we would be, basically net zero by 2045, so it's 5 years earlier, and net zero in transportation, in industry, in agriculture. People have forgotten about agriculture, but that's a big one, and in electricity, and virtually net zero in every major activity. That's an impossible goal. It's an absolutely impossible goal, and it's not only is it impossible, but if we achieved it, we'd be living, California's grid problems would be nothing compared to what you'd be seeing in the next 25 years. So I mean, I think everything needs to be revisited, rethought, and we need to have this big debate as to why are we doing this. And unfortunately, that means we also have to address, and nobody wants to talk about this, but address the whole underlying claim that, again, that the world is coming to an end and coming to a fiery end because of climate change, which is just nonsense.
Well, when you then find that some of the extreme members, and bless them, they're there to march in the streets and to put posters up of people who are climate villains in France during climate meetings. But they've turned on the folks who want zero carbon, net zero, and they want real zero now.
I know. Net zero means at least you can have some offsets.
Right.
They want zero. That's correct. And again, like I said, that's the even more perfect being more an enemy of the good. So
Yeah. So where do you think we wind up with this? Does this become the cornerstone of a bunch of General Assembly campaigns in 2023, or is it too nerdy for that?
I don't think it is. I think that's the beauty of what's going on now. Now that people can see the outcome, now that people can see, well, if you are willing to pay the the RGGI carbon tax on your electric bill or not, because that's an outcome of this debate. I mean, that's a straight tie back to this whole argument. If you like the RGGI tax, if you like the idea of mandating the elimination of all gasoline and diesel cars and trucks, if you like the idea that we should have this offshore wind facility that's going to run maybe 40% one day and 10% the next day and 0%, for a long 7-day stretch or something. If you think those are great outcomes, then by all means, keep voting this way. But if you can see these consequences for what they are and for the dangers that they pose, and then ask yourself, is it really the end of the world, or is this something that's very slowly happening? Do we have time to actually adapt to what little climate change is actually happening? And I think people, if they apply their brains to it, are going to conclude that we've allowed ourselves to be talked into a bad path, and we need to change the path.
And it is changeable. I mean, that's the joy of where we are. I mean, it is something that we can correct ourselves.
And again, there will be electric cars. There will be offshore wind. There will be onshore wind. Those are all viable options. They just can't carry the load all by themselves.
Right. And a friend of mine said, we used to ship using only wind energy back in the day, and we decided there were more efficient ways to do it. You mentioned RGGI, and I know I promised last one, but I've watched way too much Columbo, Steve, and you and I wind up in these conversations. But you said RGGI. I want to get caught up on Governor Youngkin's attempts to get us out of the regional greenhouse gas initiative and catch us up on where that all is right now.
Well, he announced last week, or his Secretary of Natural Resources announced last week, that they will be filing a regulatory process. Again, the RGGI was imposed under a regulatory structure. It's the same Air Pollution Control Board as is dealing with the cars. And it was, of course, the Northam Air Pollution Control Board that did this. The General Assembly authorized it. In my opinion, it did not mandate it, but some court will be asked as to whether he had his effort to repeal it by regulation, I'm sure, will be challenged in court. But that's what they're going to do. They're going to push through a regulatory process. The good news is that it's an open process. People will have a chance to participate. The bad news is it's slow. It can be very slow. And unfortunately, while they're going through that, we're still paying the tax. There's another matter of fact. There's an auction going on. You and I are talking on Monday the 6th. There's an auction going on today. To this very day, there are more RGGI taxes being imposed on Virginia electricity customers, and
it's all for other people's pollution, or to trade it in as like a commodity that we've created. At least it's not Bitcoin, I guess, Steve.
Actually, there's a little the beauty. I mean, so again, the utility buys X number of allowances. Some of the allowances they might use to operate their gas plant, operate their coal plant. Those allowances have value all by themselves. They will keep those allowances as, in speculation, hold them. If they go up in value, they'll sell them for a profit. I mean, there's a whole marketplace in those allowances.
Which drives the real zero crowd, because then they're saying...
That's right. Well, which also drives up the cost to the rest of us.
Yep. Steve Hayner, again, it's the Thomas Jefferson Institute and Bacon's Rebellion, where you say thank you as always. You're so gracious with your time, and I'm glad you're firing off the columns like crazy now, because there just seems to be just so much incoming on this, and we appreciate it.
It is a target-rich environment.
What is next for you?
I'll follow through on some of this stuff dealing with the governor's energy plan, and again, I'll be very curious to watch the process as the SCC looks closely at, reconsiders its decision on the performance agreement, performance standard. I mean, I hope they stand firm, but they could change their mind if they're allowed to.
Mm-hmm. Especially if there's only two of them. Steve, thank you so much. You have a blessed week.
Thank you. You too, sir. Bye.
And we'll be back with more Freedom and Prosperity Radio next.